reaction to the New York Football Giants, as we know, falling the Atlanta Falcons at home, 17-14, last second field goal. Well, listen, I'm sure everyone's, maybe you watch the post-game press conference. We kind of get those same usual takeaways from Joe Judge, some positive things, stuff we got to work on. What are we going to do next? How are we going to get better, continue to work? Obviously, those are talking points that aren't going to fly anymore. You're going to hear a lot of things like the honeymoon is over with Joe Judge. It's time to figure out what's next, right? What are the Giants going to do to fix this thing? Where do the problems lie? Specifically on this game, and we're going to cover it tomorrow again as well, so you don't have to worry about missing out on any of the information. I'll go over it with Andy Makowitz, obviously, get some of his takeaways and figure out where this team stands. This is a hard one from the standpoint of, obviously, you lose the game. But I was going to say Sterling Shepard. You lose Darius Slayton. You lose Blake Martinez. You see Saquon Barkley trying to continue to get better and move himself forward, but also being a little bit tentative and a little bit timid. And you just wonder when is he going to get fully back? What is that going to look like? And I've just had a really hard time now because this was supposed to be a game against an opponent that you felt like, off of the game you had last week against Washington, which, by the way, you saw how they looked this week. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of the competition you were playing against, but you just felt like things were moving in the right direction. And to have a question mark like Daniel Jones coming into the season seemingly be getting that closer and closer to a check mark as someone we can count on and can be successful in this league and can be dynamic and all those different things, to see the circumstance play out where what are we supposed to take away from this game? The defense struggled again late, but they could have produced a couple of turnovers. The luck or unlucky bounce of the football, they end up not being able to make those plays. Okay, fine. Offensively, how am I supposed to judge what happened here? The offensive line has struggled. It lacked 2 starters. They played well enough. Daniel Jones looked good. Once you lose all those weapons, how are you supposed to have success? We all agree that obviously Evan Ingram is a problem. Go back to, I got on board with him at the start of this season. He started not on IR, but wasn't able to play for the first couple of weeks of the season due to injury. But I said this for the last 2 years. You should have moved him. His value has been completely diminished. And anything that you think, if you were going to try to move him this year as you're 0-3 and maybe the wheels are starting to come off a little bit, you're not getting anything for him now. There's no value in this player. So you're going to ride out the rest of the season with him. But I mentioned this the last time a little bit on the podcast. I'm going to mention it again here now too. And Andy and I are going to get into where he thinks some of the issues lie. We text a little bit after the game, and there's validity in his opinion on it too. I think that there's a lot of different areas you can point to. But this is where you go back and you think, you bring in a first-year head coach last year, you go 6-10, you feel like you got some good vibe and energy, and then you make the decision to go away from certain players that have been on this roster. You don't bring back a Dalvin Tomlinson. You don't bring back even a Fackrell. Seems like a low-level guy, right? You do bring back Leonard Williams, and then you go out and you make some splash plays. You tie it in with what you do in the draft. With all these injuries there, where was Kadarius Toney? Now, is that on the play calling of Jason Garrett, not figuring out ways to utilize him once you had some injuries there to other key wide receivers? Is that on Kadarius Toney for not being prepared and capable of absorbing the playbook and being dynamic, as we've seen other rookie wide receivers already be this season? Is it on Joe Judge / Dave Gettleman for choosing to trade down in the first round? Positive move, but then draft a wide receiver at 20 and not have him be the proverbial steal of the draft and come in and be ready to play. So it's layer by layer by layer by layer. Is it John Mara's fault for having Dave Gettleman in charge? It's really hard to figure out which boxes you want to check here and where you want to place the blame, because there are always these caveats. Yeah, and by the way, and this is really just, I came on to basically have a post-game rant in a lot of ways. You signed Kenny Golladay. Remember, Andy and I were not we were tentative on it, right? Because you're going to go out and you're going to spend this big money, and that's great. But Kenny Golladay came into this game with what? A bit of a hip injury. What did he have last year? A bit of a hip injury. So the fact that you went out, right? This is where you think you pull yourself back and you say, so which is it? Is it that the Giants, with our recent history and track record of draft picks or free agency signings and success or failures, Is it the Giants figured out a way to get Kenny Golladay? Or that most other teams weren't willing to take that risk or looking to take him on at X dollar amount? Because the Giants were willing to do it. And is that because they feel confident in what he's going to be big picture for them? Is that because Dave Gettleman thinks this is the perfect weapon to unlock our offense, or because he's worried that he needs to justify Daniel Jones? So you start swinging big for the fences in free agency and you bring in a player that maybe, while quality, is not necessarily where your money would have been best spent. And then if you do that, why do you go get Tony? I understand everyone says you need weapons. You got to prepare for the future. You got to think about Shepard being gone. You got to think about the fact that Evan Ingram sucks. Let's just put that in plain English. He's terrible. He's been terrible. But all of a sudden, you got to take this step back now and realize that to start this season, you've had a limited Kenny Golladay, you've had no Kadarius Toney, and you've had a limited Saquon Barkley, combined with a banged-up offensive line. And yet, Daniel Jones has looked pretty darn consistent and solid for you. Little mixed bag there in week 1 against Denver. And we'll see. You got big challenges coming up against the New Orleans Saints and that defensive front, obviously, too. But he's looked pretty good. So what would be more important? Bringing in a multitude of weapons or solidifying some of the key ingredients to this team, like the offensive line? Now, theoretically, you can say, coming into the year, we were going to have Shane Lemieux, and we were going to have Nick Gates at center, and we were going to feel really good about it. The fact that Matt Pert ends up being a problem and a concern and loses his starting job to Nate Solder, you had to have already known that that was a possibility before you got to the season. You can't learn that information on the fly. So that's red flag number 1. Red flag number 2 is, regardless of if he's played pretty well so far this season, you think it's reasonable, you're getting reasonable returns on him, you can't have Hernandez be your starting right guard when you had last year Kevin Zeitler plugged in there. I'm not saying that Kevin Zeitler is an all-pro right guard, but I am saying that he's probably worth it for the one more year at $10 million just to make sure you don't have to worry about that in case something were to happen and an injury were to befall your offensive line. You wouldn't all of a sudden be staring down the barrel of throwing Price into the mix, who threw one over Daniel Jones' shoulder. And it's not even a knock on him. But now all of a sudden you're throwing in a guy who wasn't here in training camp and you made a trade for him. You moved Nick Gates, the guy that you felt good about at center, to left guard because of the scramble situation you were in. These are the questions that you have to ask about the team that's been put together. And it's a top-down piece. And that's why this game, it may feel like, this team is trash and it's garbage and all these other things. You can't just go spend money on talent for talent's sake. And that's what this feels like. And I think I said this on the podcast to Andy at one point. Remember a guy by the name of Jerry Reese who really started going out there and swinging the money around, the big dollars, to improve this team, kind of as a last-ditch effort to save his job, which he didn't. And then he got fired. And then you brought in Dave Gettleman, you brought in Sherman, McAdoo, all this garbage, right? But you're standing there, today is a great example. Andy, we'll hear from him tomorrow. He was over at the stadium for this one. Seeing Eli Manning get his jersey retired, into the Ring of Honor he goes, throws the recreation of the play to David Tyree and to Mario Manningham, and everyone is so feeling so good about it, right? Cut 2, though, you can't see it as a franchise that Eli Manning was a solid quarterback who showed up every week, played the position without fail, showed up every Sunday, took the lumps, played through it, and made the big plays when you needed it the most. He was never a top 5 quarterback in the league. He was never the statistical leader across the board in all these categories. This organization has had a formula of being solid on the offensive line and solid on the defensive line, and then putting in good weapons around the quarterback and having success. So what is this narrative? Listen, there's the Super Bowl where you brought in Plexico Burress. We saw what that did for Eli Manning's game, obviously. And that's great. But you didn't need it every single step along the way. You were able to figure it out with strong running games. You were able to figure it out with solid offensive line. That's number 1. And then on the defensive side of it, in this game, listen, Leonard Williams got home a couple times. Ojulari had the strip sack there on Matt Ryan. He's coming along. I like the growth. I like the trajectory. But are you going to tell me that in a game like this, you maybe don't miss Dalvin Tomlinson a little bit and what he could have opened up for you, maybe shutting down the running game a little more readily, maybe pushing the pocket a little bit, freeing up Leonard Williams, freeing up Dexter Lawrence? Question mark, where are you, sir, with more consistency now in year number 3? I don't know. It's really hard because on paper, Adoree Jackson and Kenny Golladay, these are good players. They're solid, top tier kind of players. And yet, was that the most important place to spend your money this offseason? Because the proof is bearing it out a little bit. Isolated inside of this game, it's really hard for me to draw any hard facts or conclusions from it because of all the injuries, and it's brutal. I can draw the fact that the Giants had 8 more penalties in this one. I think 7 or 8 of them were in the first half. That feels unacceptable. I can draw the fact that maybe defensive players are feeling a little bit of pressure on themselves. There's some opportunities. The Logan Ryan pick, I mean, that's off his hands. It's a hard one to get to. Adoree Jackson's going to tell you 9,000 times out of 9,001 times he's got to get that pick in the end zone because it drops to him. He's a guy, as they said on the broadcast, return experience. You know, I mean, his hands are good. He's got to make those plays, right? So you even had a late break, I think, by Logan Ryan later in the game. Bradbury, a lot of opportunities for turnovers in this one. The defense isn't quite getting there. And then they bend and they ultimately break in the fourth quarter. It is what it is. You know, offensively, it's unfortunate. There's a couple of things Andy pointed out. Healthy scratch for Booker. Listen, I said it in the offseason. I'll say it again now. Devontae Booker was a mildly expensive $2.53 million total cost all in insurance policy for if Saquon Barkley was broken this year, if he wasn't going to be able to come along with some level of consistency. And he has 10 carries, right? We'll look at the stat line here in a second from what he did in this particular game. He's coming along, but guess what? And I hate to break it to you. He still dances around in the backfield behind a bad offensive line. I get it. A weak one with injuries. One's trying to figure things out on the fly. He still wants to tap dance. He still wants to make the big play when the 3 or 4 yards going forward is more than enough for you. This again, though, dive over the top there, got the touchdown, right? How much we'll be talking about Daniel Jones blowing back a defensive lineman on the 2-point conversion if the Giants had won this game. There's a lot of things you can look at as positives here, but when you start to read the tea leaves around this team, when you go and you watch that Carolina Panthers game where Christian McCaffrey gets hurt and they just had paid him before, now he's making $16 million on the books and it doesn't look like he's going to be available, and he's certainly dynamic, and the offense and the running game did not look the same after he went out. What's going to happen with Saquon Barkley? What is the best case scenario? That he looks really good and you're on the books for $15 million a year when you re-up him? That's not the answer. And I hate to break it to you, at 0-3 now, the writing's on the wall. You can turn this thing around and maybe you come out and you beat the Saints somehow. Difficult matchup against the Cowboys. I don't know. Maybe you somehow do turn this thing around. I'm not going to tell you it's impossible. It certainly seems unlikely, though. But at what point do you have to look at this roster now and say, how do we finally do the thing that we were supposed to have done 2-3 years ago? Rebuild the explicit tag avoided. Rebuild the team. You already stockpiled these picks next year. And guess what? If you think that Daniel Jones can be the guy and he can prove that this season, then all of a sudden you got a lot of picks to do a lot of good work with. But if this team is going to keep losing ball games here, the questions around Joe Judge come into play. The questions around Dave Gettleman come into play. The questions have always been there as they were booing John Mara today. What players are you going to move here? You got to be smart. You got to make the decision that this is not working. How do we move off and get value on certain players? Evan Ingram's one of them. And how do you make sure that you get maximum value, understanding that these guys are going to be diminished quality, diminished value this season? You say, I don't need the draft pick next year. I got a stockpile there. Give me the following one. Somebody wants to give you a 5th round pick next year in the draft for Ingram. Give me a 4th round 2 years from now. Jabril Peppers, same thing. Whatever the tag is, maybe I bump it back a year and I get a little bit better of quality in the draft. Same thing for Saquon Barkley. I'm as big a fan of him as anybody, but it's not going to be worth it when you pay him. It's flat out not. There's too many examples around the league of running backs getting taken later in the draft, and the type of running back that he is diminishes him too. He's not a pound-it running back. He's not an angry runner north and south. That guy you can pay and live with. You can Jerome Bettis this thing for all I care. But a guy that's a home run hitter, when now you've brought in this other bevy of weapons, you got to find a way to balance this roster, and you got to find a way to give yourself some financial freedom to fix some other issues. Locking yourself into 15 million next year with him is going to be a problem. I don't know if there's trade value for him or not. And the Giants aren't going to trade him this year. Let's just be clear. They could do it in the offseason. They got his 5th year option. But if you get a team that comes calling, if you get a team that has Sony Mitchell right now starting for them because Henderson's hurt, and they think that they have places to go this season, maybe there's something there. It's time to start making the hard choices about who's staying or going on this roster and how you're going to rebuild it. I've been hanging on tooth and nail to this season that the Giants could have success. One thing I know is that the Washington football team might be total garbage. The division is still probably relative garbage. And maybe you can get some wins there. Maybe there's win. I don't know. Maybe there are wins. Maybe there's 6 wins here. Maybe there's 7 wins here. I'm not going to totally abandon the success this team could have, especially with the injuries they dealt with today. But man, when you take that big step back, it is really hard to come out and have an 0-3 start to this season with the type of talent you have on both sides of the ball, injuries and all, and feel like you didn't have a real missed opportunity here. Denver Broncos, Washington football team, Atlanta Falcons. Even 1-2 right now. If you had won that Washington game, you could maybe get away with it because of the injuries today. But 0-3 is a hard pill to swallow. And there has to be some changes here. Andy's probably going to tell you one of them tomorrow on the podcast. And maybe he's right. And that's fine. Make the change if you want to make the change. Make any change that you think can get this thing going in the right direction. Listen, Aaron Robinson's still not on the field for this defense. Ellerson Smith not on this team. Kadarius Toney, for whatever reason, not yet fully integrated into the offense. It is what it is. It is what it is, friends. But now's the time where you take a big step back from this franchise and start making real life health decisions here. Is it worth it? You know what I mean? I can feel myself losing a little bit. Feel myself losing a couple of beats off the old ticker when I watch this team on Sundays. I was excited for them today. It didn't work out the way I thought it would. I'd be very curious to see how they look, how they come out, and what John Mara maybe has to say over the next handful of games. The best thing you can hope for is that players that are either on a 5th year option or on the final year of their contract come out in a big way over the next few weeks, regardless of game results, and put the Giants in a position to potentially move some players if they need to. That's the deal. We'll come back in. We'll break down the game specific. We'll talk about some of the positives that maybe we saw there. We'll talk about the areas that seem to be consistently a problem for the Giants, especially on the defensive side of the ball in the secondary, being opportunistic and then capitalizing on those opportunities. We'll break it all down. 17-14 loss. The Giants will have, as I said, the Saints coming up next week, followed by a divisional game against the Dallas Cowboys on the road. So we'll see how they fare in those journeys. But this is kind of where we are, man. It's a little dose of painful reality potentially. And unfortunately, in a season, again, I'll just reiterate one last time, where we feel like we're getting some boxes checked that we wanted to, all of a sudden these other boxes that we thought, lock it up, done deal, don't need to worry about it, they've reopened now. Now all of a sudden we don't know if the best decisions were made. And if that's the case, we could be in full top to bottom rebuild mode in the blink of an eye. So that's where the New York Football Giants are. We will, as I say, be in tomorrow. Andy Makowitz and myself will break it all down. We'll go in a different direction. We'll hear his takeaways, what he thinks he should change in it. So obviously we'll give you a different perspective from what you got here. Essentially the ranting of a sad Giants fan on the internet. You can follow us on social media, One Giant Podcast. Of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, where we will be breaking it all down for you, rain or shine, sadness or or joy, all the way through the New York Football Giants season. Thank you, as always, for joining us, and we will, as we like to say, catch up with you soon. And in spite of it all, Andy Makowitz would want, need, and demand that people know. As always, let's go Big Blue.